Yes, this hearing will, the briefing rather, will reconvene. And I'd like to just begin by saying that this morning Chairman Lantos announced important legislation that will revive America's participation in Internet climate negotiations to forge a consensus that will meet the challenges we face from global warming, and I look forward to working with him to pass this critical bill. Sir, could you tell us what role does renewable energy play in your country's strategy? Do you have actual targeted goals for the percentage of renewable energy, excluding nuclear, in the total mix of the Swedish energy picture?
We have actually, Mr. Chairman, we have actually not had a national target. We said that we should, from the 70s onwards, put money into research and development, and also to be sure to find ways of introducing renewable energy. But it's actually now that we get this target coming from the European system, where we are saying it must come up to 20% of our energy production. Then one should remember that Sweden is already, I think, up at 27. Very much due to the fact that we have so much water power in Sweden. But the way this target is met is to say that wherever you are now, you should also take a part of burden sharing inside the European Union. So after that decision we're taking in March of this year, it will come back to be a discussion among the countries of the European Union together with the Commission on a burden sharing scheme. So even though we are above the target already, we will get an increased target with this burden sharing. We have very good means, of course, to introduce renewables, since we have a lot of wood, we have a lot of water, we have good conditions for wind, and we are also now learning to use solar energy, especially linked to housing. So in all areas, I can see that things are now happening. So we could definitely increase our portion of renewables in the forthcoming years.
What about the fuel economy of the vehicles in Sweden? Do you have actual miles per gallon, kilometers per gallon standards that you establish?
No, Mr. Chairman, no. But we have had, as I mentioned, high taxation on oil or on petrol for very many years, which actually have put up the price as high that it made it possible, also together, I would say, with the rise in the world price of oil, to introduce renewables also in that part of the economy. This is the one part that we need to do more. If we look into Sweden, we have a very old car park, and a lot of our cars are also quite big. It could also be said to be the fact that as Mr. Chairman pointed out, we are part of an Arctic region. Well, only part of our country, but still it's quite cold in Sweden, and there are long transports. So here is where we need to do more. And every time I'm now listening to the industry in these areas, they are working very much both by making it more fuel efficient, the engines they are taking forward, but also to open up for renewables. We also introduced a special rebate or money given to anyone who would buy an environmental friendly car, just now announced, which actually now starts booming even more the market for buying environmental friendly cars. So it's going quite quickly for the moment.
Let me turn and recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. This is a real treat. As I was telling you, I spent 4 months in 1972 in your great country doing a research project comparing the energy use policies of Seattle, Washington to Stockholm, Sweden. And what we concluded is Sweden was about 20 years ahead of us then. And we learned some lessons from them, and we've done some great things over the last 2 decades, but now we're finding Sweden really maybe is ahead of us again in certain ways. So it's a real treat. I appreciate you coming here. You've had some real success. You told us that you've reduced your CO2 emissions 7% by, is it by 1990? Is that right? Tell us, if you will, have there been any learning experiences in that effort? Any mistakes Sweden has made? You've had some spectacular successes. Have you had any learning experiences with any of your policies that may not have been as successful as you would have liked? We've learned from your successes. We'd also like to learn from some of your glitches, if any.
Well, thank you, Mr. Representative. I think that going back to the 70s, this was very much affected, of course, on the oil price shock in the early 70s in Sweden. We learned that our oil dependency was a great problem for ourselves, our economy, and the discussion started what to do to get less dependent. That was also the start of the debate on how to view nuclear energy in Sweden, and the 70s, partly the answer was to build new nuclear plants. But that was also the start of a lot of the resources put into renewable energy projects. And I remember all through my teenage years and also starting politics, I always heard that we were giving a lot of resources to renewables, and everyone asked, so where are they then? So to answer to the question, I think that very many of these projects probably showed not to be as successful as we would have hoped. We didn't have probably the knowledge then to actually produce wind power, solar power with the effectiveness that was needed. But again, there was a kind of investment, because now everyone tells me that we have a greater knowledge, and now we can base actually a lot of these investments in what is actually now compatible, and it's also coming into the market. It would never have happened if we have not put resources into research and development. We needed also, as I mentioned, this early carbon tax to increase the pressure on taking in renewables. And I think also at the time now, with the emissions trading scheme in European Union, that's even putting this even further, pushing on. So I think it's important to say that the combination of technological improvements, even though a few of the projects is just waste money, these tax and schemes that you need to direct industry in the right direction, but also, which my companies tell me, that especially European Union have been working with standards, saying that in 15 years you have to meet with engines with less emissions than we have today, and then they actually fixate how much there can be. So the combination of this has changed the logic of this so much that today when I meet industrialists, they tell me, well, that's good, because now we know what to look upon. And if you give us the time to put our resources right, we will meet these standards. What often happens is that if you say you should be there in 10 years, and they start off trying to get there, they are already there in 3 or 4 years.
Right.
Because we see this all the time. So one shouldn't be that afraid. But I think it has been, I mean, Sweden is part of Europe, everyone is nearby. So of course, in the way that European Union has taken upon itself also to actually put forward legislation saying that you have to meet with these targets, that has been very helpful.
Have you experienced, there's a fear of a cap and trade system here that all of industry will flee and go to non-capped countries. Has Sweden experienced that? Have you experienced a collapse of your industrial base as a result of being part of this regimen?
No, we have not. And I've heard that. I used to hear a lot of that. I sometimes hear that if you put higher pressure on us, and if you do not listen, we might create the problem of losing jobs or losing production. But the truth is that it has not happened to a larger extent that globalization, of course, puts pressures on part of our production. It's true to say, as I mentioned in my speech, that part of this is probably now in China. But then again, job creation and what has come instead is now booming in the Swedish economy. We have a booming renewable sector, which actually now create jobs and investments in Sweden. I would also add one other thing, which is very important to see, because I also hear about this discussion in the United States. My companies now say that if they are not environmental friendly, if they are not at the top of this, they will lose markets. So it's actually also good business to be ahead in taking products which are climate friendly, because the consumers are very aware of the risks or of the threat on climate. So they are asking, is it environmental friendly, things like that. So I think one should remember that keeping this away could also be a way of losing in competition in a few years' time.
And I'd like to report, I think we're going to be moving in this direction here. I know you've been waiting for it, but I can tell you I think we're moving in the right direction. One more question. I was so impressed in 1972 looking at how far Sweden had gone in efficiency. Now, do I understand you've got another goal of 20% energy efficiency by 2020? Is it? And how are you going to meet that? What's the principal things to do in that regard?
Absolutely, Mr. Representative. One thing that we did in the 70s was said that we had to secure that the houses were not losing energy, losing heat. And maybe we made the mistake to make them too tight because, nothing came out and it was said to be bad housing. We have learned more from that now, but it's extremely important to look into how we build houses so that what we now see that the modern house is very often built on the logic that the things you do inside yourself in the house, if you have machines, things like that, is actually also taking care of the heating. So it's no heating added to just that you move around in the house. And I've been in these houses in Sweden. It's fantastic to see they need nearly no energy at all to heat up. So we have fantastic means to actually meet with that today. That's important to do more, to go into areas where we already have, especially apartment areas, to do this also in old buildings, because that is turning back energy efficiency. We are also looking at what was actually now mentioned at the EU summit in March to introduce, and I see that Australia is also discussing this, on taking lamps, this low energy lamps everywhere. Right. So that might also be something. And of course also to be very precise, to discuss with the public, which now is also done in Sweden. How can you consume less energy by thinking about it? That was very much the lesson of the 70s. Don't have lights on, don't put all your machines on, turn them off when you go to bed, things like that.
Mr. Prime Minister, tack så mycket.
Yeah, tack så mycket.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the joint hearing and the efforts that are going on here. I think they all favor well for what we're trying to do in the 110th Congress, and we appreciate the Prime Minister obviously taking time to come and share with him his experience in Sweden. Obviously, Sweden has been a leader in many areas, and we appreciate the input. Last month, I was in a German Marshall Fund exchange in Brussels, meeting with European parliamentary members and others. And we have an exchange with Congress. A number of us are going to be going back at the end of this month in Berlin. And you talked about the fact that Sweden in 2009 is going to assume the presidency of the EU in your opening statement. And when we look at the trade that exists throughout the world, and of course we're all interested in emerging markets and not just the G20, but things that are going on in India and China. But when you look at world trade as a whole, and you look at the U.S., the North America, and Europe, it constitutes the majority of trade. And so we have so many things in common as it relates to labor standards and many environmental standards and other things. Yet commonality of rules and standards is something that we still struggle with. Last week we announced open skies, and trying to generalize accounting principles, standards. You may know where I'm going with this in terms of my question to you. I learned at the conference last month that for automotive makers, both Europe and the U.S., we have to do a car crash test twice, once for European standards and once for U.S. standards. It seems to be rather duplicative at least and absurd at worst. Where do you think the commonality is going? You talked about Sweden in your opening statements, but within the European Union that can end up being the basis for common standards between not just the U.S., but North America, Canada, and us, along with our partners, our friends, and of course you have the same challenges we have. You have a lot of different climates when you look at the 27 countries in the EU. So climatology is a big issue. How you implement standards that are even-handed. I wish you could give us a snapshot on where you think that's going and where the opportunities might be as it relates for leveling the playing field, so to speak, on things that we should have in common.
Well, yes, thank you, Mr. Representative. I mean, the basic idea of European Union, going back to the Rome Treaty of '57, was to actually say we should create an internal market, and that should be based on free trade, very important for small countries, especially like Sweden, who have grown rich on having the possibility to trade with other countries. So of course, we were very interested in this. And what happened was that they said that it should be a freedom of movement of goods and people, but very often that was hindered by the fact that we had different standards, and still actually sometimes have today.
Yes, so as we apply that to green technologies and energy standards and a whole host of efforts that are ongoing.
Absolutely, and so the way to meet this was to get the Commission of the European Union to be stronger, to say that we need to focus on standards, both to make it more possible to deliver or sell goods, because otherwise it was a kind of domestic way to keep out competition and not be able to take in anything. And this was actually working. Companies were coming to me saying, well, you say this is freedom of goods, but I can't come into Spain, I can't come into France because they have still different standards. And that also linked to environmental friendly standards. So yes, this will definitely be part of how now European Union sees the future, also on renewables, on burden sharing, different things. It comes back to standards. To be able to impose that we actually meet these targets that we have put up. And I'm very sure that all the business life in Europe has learned that you need to be present in Brussels, because that's where they are now formulating the standards.
Well, marking progress there would be important for us. The other thing, how about cap and trade? How do you see the European Union looking at the implementation of that effort?
I'm not sure that that will be the case, because I know that you have this discussion linked to China, and of course we have also seen, as I mentioned, production leave Europe. Very often I should say that we have also seen production leave Western Europe going to Eastern Europe. So it's also an inside discussion in Europe, and partly saying that maybe that part of that is good, because that's actually now building Eastern Europe from poverty to a better strength. Therefore, if we can avoid any kind of cap or anything that would conflict freedom of trade, and find other means. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything, because we're trying to do a lot of other things. I think that should be more efficient. But then again, that also needs to then follow what happens in China, and how do they meet their own environmental structure or signals they get from their people to do more.
My time's expired, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much for being so generous with your time. In familiarizing myself with what your country has done, and I must also say that you've done it far ahead of what we are doing here. But there's a diversification of the fuels, and so I'm wondering what impact it has had on gasoline prices at the pump. What would you say the national average in Sweden is now for a gallon of gas?
Well, a gallon is a good question because we don't have it as a gallon in Sweden. It would be probably $1.80 or something for a liter. We have a liter system.
Yeah.
So it's how many times higher in Sweden than in U.S.? 2 times higher in Sweden than in U.S. Or maybe exactly, I would say stretching out 3 times higher to buy petrol in Sweden. Everyone on my electorate would tell you, Mr. Representative, that it's very expensive, and that they are. Yeah, you've heard that before, but it's now at a high level that actually makes it market possible to introduce other ethanol, RME, other things that we are putting forward. They can actually compete because the price is quite high.
Are you importing most of the ethanol?
And most of the ethanol, well, we have this discussion, should it be domestically produced? But to be very honest, the most environmental friendly climate change approach would probably be to take it from Brazil, because they have a better climate process in taking their ethanol, and it would also be cheaper. So I think that for our future, and there is a lot of demand for ethanol, because a lot of our environmental friendly car is driven by ethanol. So we have now shortages of ethanol in the Swedish economy, but most of it will probably in the future come from Brazil. But there are also talks, that's part of our talks with the US, that we might also have other means of how to produce ethanol.
But I mean, Sweden is much smaller geographically than the United States, and so we're having a challenge here. For example, we took 20% of the feedstock out of the market last year for the production of ethanol, and as a result, then the farmers began to complain because the costs began to rise, and I'm not sure that we have enough available and productive land to make it a serious impact with ethanol in this country. I think it has to be a diversification here as well. But one of the things that I found interesting is that the energy production, your energy production, is dominated by hydroelectricity and nuclear energy. And I'm just wondering, I mean, we're discussing all of those things here, but what are you doing now with the waste in the nuclear area? I mean, what are you doing to dispose of the waste? Or is that and is that a controversial issue in Sweden?
Absolutely, Mr. Representative. I think that Sweden also have had its share of discussing nuclear energy from the 70s onwards, and we have still not solved the issue where to put it more finally. Even though I should say that the geological circumstances in Sweden is much better than in many other parts of the world, since it's quite stable. It's not an unstable part of the world to have this final put away of the waste, but that's still looked into, so to speak. But I mean, even if we were to abolish all of our nuclear plants, it's still an issue, because we have a lot of this nuclear waste. We have had nuclear energy since the beginning of the 70s, and for the moment we have don't close down, don't start new one policy on nuclear energy, which is in our alliance government. So we are saying that let's look how fast the renewables are now coming forward. But I live in a part of the world where they're actually, and that's not so common anymore, are building new nuclear plants. We are building an extra one in Finland next to us. There is also talks of building new ones in Lithuania. Surrounding Sweden, we now see new production of nuclear plants. So it's still there. It's still a discussion on should this play a role, and what should that role be also in the climate change.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister.
You gave us until 4 o'clock, Mr. Prime Minister, but John Larson, who's the Vice Chairman of the Democratic Caucus, has arrived. And if you could just indulge us for a few more minutes, I think he has some very important questions to ask you. The gentleman from Connecticut.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts, and more importantly, welcome Prime Minister. And as an individual of Swedish descent, I'm proud to have you in our country. And I was unfortunately couldn't be at the meeting with Speaker Pelosi earlier today either, but I wanted to commend your great country and home of my forebears for your efforts in global warming and reducing greenhouse gases. And I just have one quick question for you. And have you, as the Swedish government, pursuing fuel cell alternatives as well? Are you doing anything in the hydrogen field in that area?
Okay. Yes, we have projects like that. I would say that the diversity of means to actually drive a car is now fantastic. It's bioenergy, it's ethanol, it's RME, and I would say that everything is now coming forward. And what we are trying to say is that we should not, as a government, point out that this is the one and the rest can forget it. So we are just trying to say that it should be open, it should be possible for all of them, and we put a lot of efforts in keeping up so that they feel that they could try to commercialize what they are doing. And it's a little bit conflicting because it's very popular now to buy cars, but the discussion in what kind of renewable I should turn to. That's a discussion I hear everywhere now in Sweden, because what will be the long-standing? And I'm not sure. Maybe that's good, because I'm not sure what will be the most commercially sound system out of these. But yes, we have that as well, and we have supported that.
Our distinguished chair was having the same discussion with me just last Friday, what particular hybrid I should buy. And so I thank him for that as well, and I'm imploring him, because the committee is going to probably be traveling to Greenland, and they were talking about Iceland. I think that Sweden should be right up there on the list that the committee should stop in. I think there's so much for us to learn, and after all, if we're going to consider stopping in Ireland, maybe we should stop in Sweden also,
Well, Mr. Chairman, you're very welcome. I hope to see you in Sweden. I hope I can deliver a lunch or something so we can discuss these matters in place.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman from the Swedish gentleman from Connecticut for his contribution, and we thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Speaker Pelosi created this Select Committee on Global Warming because she wants to give a special emphasis to this issue to try to accomplish something during this Congress. She's committed to it. She thinks that after the war in Iraq, it's the issue that we just have to come to grips with as a people. And your testimony here today greatly helps us in our deliberations. Again, I apologize to you, but that intermission, unfortunately, because they knew we had to adjourn at 4 o'clock, then discouraged people from coming back because they knew they would not be able to be recognized for their 5 minutes. But there were about 20 members who were planning on being here throughout the duration, and the key members who will be looking at this issue of climate change. I thank you for your participation, and I hope the rest of your visit to the United States goes well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.